I can't help read the Beatitudes without thinking of Monty Python's Life of Brian. Anyone familiar with it? Yeah, there's a couple of faces nodding. Yeah, you'll know where I'm going with that. At All Saints' Tide, who are the saints that you think of? Who are the patron saints that immediately spring to your mind? Jolly old St. Nicholas, who comes at Christmas perhaps? St. Anthony, who helps us find things and people that are lost? St. Christopher, who we might believe keeps us safe when we travel? St. Valentine, the inspirer of romance? Or St. Jude, one of my favourites, the patron saint of lost causes. Very popular, I think, with many of us. Some of us who come from a more Catholic background may have grown up with little statues or pictures or cards. Some may have necklaces or charms or bracelets, with the idea that somehow the saints have the power to inspire, guide and protect us along our way through life, because they're thought to somehow have the ear of God in a special way. In the past few years, though, much has changed in the Catholic tradition. Many of the legends of the old saints have been re-examined and found to be wanting. Indeed, it's been suggested that some of them never actually existed at all. But there are saints who certainly were real and whose lives still impact us today in practical ways. The profound theological reflections of St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, for example, they still influence our spiritual searching and searching today. We not only remember them, but we treasure the gifts that they brought to Christianity and spirituality over the centuries. All Saints, however, today reminds us that we are by no means limited to those who have been officially canonised, or the saints who are commemorated on their special individual days within the Christian calendar. All Saints speaks of those who were not famous, not remembered by everyone, but whose lives and deeds have nevertheless endured. That's not to say for a moment that these people were perfect. In fact, saints in general have a strong track record, not only of being imperfect, but of being decidedly odd. Even the most famous figures don't quite fit our expectations as to what makes a saint in many cases. St. Peter himself, if it hardly fits the traditional image, he was rash, impetuous, prone to talk too much and to make promises that he couldn't keep. And what about St. Paul? How strange to devote your life to killing Christians, then suddenly see the light on the Damascus Road and spend the rest of your life spreading the message of Christianity around the Mediterranean region. And from what we read of St. Paul's, it seems that he wasn't an easy person to please. Then there's St. Augustine, who lived on raw vegetables and promiscuity for years and years, while famously praying, "Lord, make me chaste and content, but not just yet." Then he met God in a garden and became the most inspired theologian of the early Christian centuries. The offbeat stories of the saints and what they inspired doesn't stop there. Devotees of St. Vitus used to go on for a whole night of wild dancing in the chapel, believing that this would keep them free of ills for the rest of their life. St. Vitus went on to become the patron saint of dancers and comedians. St. Perpetua, along with her companions, had many bizarre adventures until she was finally put to the sword after being tossed by an infuriated cow, so the story has it. The 13th century St. Albertus Magnus prescribed an unusual holy cure, saying, "If an ounce of elephant bone is drunk with 10 ounces of wild mountain mint from something which a leper has touched, it's a good cure for a headache." Easier to stick with paracetamol from Boots, I believe. Other shops are available. One final story concerns St. Simeon Stylites, 4th, 5th century AD, probably best known for spending 37 years living on top of a pillar near Aleppo, in modern-day Syria. But another story goes that on a journey into town one day, he found a dead dog on a dung heap. He picked it up, tied its leg to a rope round its waist and went through the streets dragging the creature behind him. He attached himself to the local church and during the services threw nuts at the clergy and blew out candles. He also developed a theatrical limp. At the baths, he ran naked into the women's section, and on solemn fasting days, he feasted riotously, consuming huge amounts of beans, apparently, with deliberate and entirely predictable results. Actually, Simeon was one of the types known as the Holy Fool, and there was at least some method in his madness. His strange behaviour was a kind of acted-out sermon, an indictment of what he saw as the world's false and foolish standards to show. And, as St. Paul said, that God chooses foolish things of this world to shame those who think themselves wise. It kind of works. I don't know about you, but I find the very oddness, the very human traits of many of the saints rather more inspiring than visions of ethereal figures clothed in white robes, floating around in a cloud of dry ice or incense, with a pious look on their faces. These real saints, these odd saints, were real people, grounded people, people I can relate to. So, St. Paul often addressed his letters, as we hear, to the saints in a particular church, and that meant all the members of that church. So today, if he wrote to us to put us on the right track, which really was what Paul was doing in a lot of his letters, saying, look, you're doing this in the church, it's not right, you want to be doing this. If he wrote to us today here, chances are he'd start off saying something like, to the saints in the Ringston and Aveland group, to the saints in Dunsby, or Hackenby, or Kirkby Underwood, or Morton, or Rippingdale. You ever thought to yourself, as a saint, really? No, me neither. But the tradition of the church tells us that we are. But that is saint, of course, with a small s rather than a capital S. Not only that, though, we're part of a bigger company of saints. Often when I come into church, particularly at All Saints, All Souls and Remembrance, I can feel an affinity with the saints that have gone before, not just the ones depicted in our windows, but the ones who have sat in the pews where you are now. There's a real sense of being part of that great company. But the Feast of All Saints, as I said, tells not only of those that have gone before us, but those of the present day, including, incredibly, you and me, in all our diversity, in all our humanness, and with all our oddness. Called to be saints. We may not rank alongside the great saints of the past. Should we even try to? Of course, some of the saints will forever remain our inspirers and our exemplars, and rightly so. They find their place in our stained glass windows, in our commemorations, in our books of listing who the saints were, in our history of the church. But isn't the idea of a hierarchy of saints contradictory? It's not what we are taught. We are taught that we are all valued by God and equally so. As I suggested, I feel I've got more in common with the oddball saints than the superstars of the Christian tradition. But what we are all called to is a strong awareness that we're made in God's image, every one of us, to reflect the nature of God, whose nature we encounter in Jesus Christ. Our own individual ways of doing things are likely to be on a smaller scale, quieter and often more unrecognised than that of the great saints. But any act of helping someone along the journey of life, not least when life is hard going, not least I would suggest in these difficult times of the coronavirus, any deed of looking after other people and looking after their welfare rather than our own, if we make that the centre of our focus, any willingness that we take to spend time to listen to other people, showing understanding, acts of forgiveness, seeking reconciliation, speaking up for those who cannot speak for themselves, any moves to establish justice and peace, even on the smallest local scale, in short, any act of love, that's what makes us saints. It's not about unreal piety, excessive devotion. It's about being essentially human and living with humanity, in humanity towards others. Today is the history of great saints. But to be sure, it's also the history of the nameless saints. Dead or alive, the saints are among us. They touch our lives every day. You've no doubt experienced some of those human saints in your everyday lives, and you're in the presence of the saints now. The novelist George Eliot was not a believer, but towards the end of Middlemarch she writes, "The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs." As we honour the saints today, let us thank God that we too, in our very ordinariness, are called to be part of that great company that no one can number. Amen.